Paris at dawn is a city of illusions, its beauty sharpest just before the day exposes the grime beneath. The first light crept along the Rue du Coq d'Or, brushing the peeling shutters and the sagging balconies as though attempting, with pitiable delicacy, to flatter what had long surrendered to neglect. The street bore the scent of stale wine, cabbage boiled to death, and humanity packed too tightly into too little space. To those with money, Paris remained the city of romance. To those without, it was a labyrinth of hunger and betrayal. I lived then in a narrow, yellowing room 6 floors above a courtyard so cramped it seemed designed not for living beings but for forgotten objects. The wallpaper, once patterned with optimistic flowers, now sloughed from the walls like aging skin. The mattress sagged in the middle as though clinging to memories of bodies better fed than mine. In the mornings, as I washed at the cracked basin, the pipes groaned like creatures resentful of being disturbed too early. Money had been a concern before, but never a crisis. Now, however, it had become a persistent ache, an invisible bruise pressed every hour by the simplest necessity. The small savings I had once possessed had vanished through a combination of honest carelessness and the slow, steady drain of existence. Each franc I had squandered seemed now to hover before me like a ghostly coin, shimmering with accusation. Downstairs lived a gallery of characters who embodied the full taxonomy of the Parisian underclass. There was the Romanian student whose violin case held more unpaid bills than music, the Italian bricklayer with a voice like gravel and manners like broken glass, the widow who brewed her own wine from raisins steeped in hope and desperation. We were united not by language or nationality, but by poverty's unmistakable stench, an odor that worked itself into clothes, skin, even into one's sense of dignity. My neighbor, Boris, was a Russian waiter of remarkable optimism and equally remarkable misfortune. Once a captain in the Imperial Army, he had been reduced to the status of a beggar who clung fiercely to his memories of grandeur. He inhabited a room even more decrepit than mine, yet greeted each morning with the certainty that today, mon ami, something splendid will happen. His faith seemed almost a form of madness, though it sustained him where logic would have failed. The cafes where I once lingered now felt like forbidden salons. I passed them hungrily, the clatter of cutlery and the murmur of well-fed conversation drifting out like taunts. Hunger became not only a physical discomfort but a kind of fog-clouding thought. One thinks in shorter sentences, notices only immediate necessities: where to find bread, how to postpone the next rent payment, which possessions can be sold without crippling tomorrow. Some evenings I walked the length of the Seine, watching the river slide under bridges with its indifferent majesty. It struck me then that Paris's beauty had nothing to do with its inhabitants. The city would remain luminous long after those who starved in its alleys were forgotten. There was a strange comfort in that, an understanding that suffering was not personal but systemic, a pattern repeated across the capitals of Europe. The hotel where I lived was run by Madame Monceau, a woman capable of kindness but possessed of an accountant's heart. She eyed tenants the way farmers examine livestock for signs of profit or illness. Her husband lurked in the background like a poorly kept secret. The two of them spoke politely to those who paid promptly, and with sharp, brittle civility to those who did not. I had once belonged to the former category. Now I hovered dangerously in the latter. It was in one of these mornings of quiet desperation that the first true shift occurred, though at the time it felt merely like another inconvenience. My last gold coin, a small and comforting relic of better days, slipped through the hole in my pocket and vanished somewhere between the butcher's shop and a gutter overflowing with old rainwater. I searched the street like a man possessed, drawing curious glances, but the coin was gone. Paris had claimed it with the efficiency of a city that knows how to swallow the fragile remains of one's security. In that moment a deeper realization took hold. I was no longer struggling against temporary misfortune but entering the long, gray corridor of genuine poverty. The sort of poverty that alters the structure of days, where meals are strategic events and time itself becomes an enemy, stretching tauntingly between one necessity and the next. And yet, amid the strain, there persisted a faint glimmer, perhaps pride, perhaps stubbornness, that prevented despair from sealing itself entirely around me. The life I had known was slipping away, but the stories unfolding in the dingy hotel, in the reeking alleys, in the kitchens and cafes where the poor scraped their survival, promised a strange, harsh truth I had never before encountered. Paris was teaching me, not gently, never gently, that poverty was not a single event but an atmosphere, thickening around one until all previous certainties dissolved. And though I stood at the threshold of a struggle that would scorch and reshape me, I could not help but sense that crossing it was unavoidable. The air of the Rue du Coq d'Or felt different now, heavier with consequence. And somewhere in that heaviness, the first faint stirrings of the coming disaster, and the coming experiment in endurance, began to take form. If the first signs of impending ruin arrived quietly, the fall itself came with a jolt. It began with the landlord's knock, 3 short, decisive taps that echoed through the corridor like a summons from fate. I opened the door to find Monsieur Monceau standing stiffly, his mustache bristling with indignation and his ledger clasped to his chest. "Monsieur," he announced, "your rent is now 5 days overdue." His tone suggested that delinquency was a sort of moral failure, a lapse of character rather than of circumstance. I attempted a polite explanation, one that skirted the humiliating truth, but Monceau raised a hand to silence me. "Tomorrow," he said simply. "No later." Then he retreated down the stairs, leaving behind an air of judgment thicker than the smell of cabbage wafting from the communal kitchen. The truth was inescapable. I had almost no money left, and tomorrow I would have none. Reassurance, even the shallow kind, was no longer possible. It was then that Boris burst into my room, his greatcoat flying behind him like a tattered banner of lost nobility. "Mon ami," he declared, breathless. "A miracle. A restaurant near the Rue de Rivoli is hiring plongeurs, dishwashers. You and I, we shall work there together. It is not glorious, but neither is starvation." His optimism, though cracked with hardship, remained astonishingly intact. I clung to it the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. The next morning, armed with nothing but hunger and borrowed confidence, we set off across Paris. The restaurant was a cavernous place buried beneath a fashionable hotel. Its kitchen sprawled like an underworld, a chaotic kingdom of steam, grease, and shouted orders. Pans clanged, cooks cursed, and a film of sweat coated everything, even the air. The manager, a bony man with eyes like a rat's, appraised us quickly and declared us hired before asking our names. That alone revealed how desperate he must have been. Thus began the plunge into a kind of labor that erodes the soul. As plongeurs, we occupied the very bottom rung of the kitchen hierarchy, a rung so low it was scarcely considered part of the ladder at all. Our queue of tasks was infinite, scrubbing pots blackened beyond recognition, hauling crates of vegetables, emptying buckets of slop into drains clogged with the remains of yesterday's failures. Every few minutes a cook would fling a pan at us and bark a command, as though cleanliness were always our fault, and filth theirs only by accident. The heat was a relentless adversary. It pressed in from all sides, thick as syrup, making one's limbs feel heavy and thoughts sluggish. By midday the sweat soaked through my shirt and trickled into my eyes, stinging them with salt. Boris, despite his limp, moved with astonishing speed, muttering encouragement between curses in at least 3 languages. "Courage, mon ami. The bourgeois eat their lobster while we drown in suds, but one day, one day—" He never finished the sentence. He never needed to. His belief in salvation, though increasingly implausible, endured like a flame shielded by shaking hands. The first wages we earned disappeared almost immediately, claimed by rent, food, and debts that had accumulated like mold. Yet, for that brief moment, having coins in my pocket restored a faint, flickering sense of agency. Each franc felt like a small rebellion against the suffocating grip of poverty. Still, life as a plonger brought its own degradation. The hours stretched monstrously, from early morning until the last plate was washed near midnight. No moment belonged to us. Even our fatigue was scheduled according to the whims of the kitchen. The cooks treated us as though we were part of the machinery, animate extensions of their own convenience. Their insults were casual, almost affectionate in their cruelty. By the end of each shift, my hands were raw and puckered, my feet pulsed with a dull ache, and my stomach roared with hunger despite the constant proximity of food. Food, of course, was forbidden to us. We lived surrounded by the aroma of roasting meats and simmering sauces, yet tasted nothing but scraps stolen furtively, a crust here, a discarded carrot there. The injustice of it gnawed more sharply than hunger itself. The worst hours were the moments just before sleep, when the body lay still but the mind raced without mercy. I found myself reflecting on the absurdity of the kitchen's oppressive hierarchy. How could a world so small, a room of sweating men and clattering pots, mirror so perfectly the vast injustices of society? Yet that was the nature of poverty. It compressed life until every detail became a symbol of something larger and crueler. As weeks passed, routine dulled the shock but sharpened the misery. My clothes hung looser, my face grew hollow, and my thoughts turned inward, shrinking to the narrow concerns of survival. I realized then that poverty did not merely exhaust, it reshaped a person from within. It narrowed horizons, redirected ambition into the most basic calculations, and replaced curiosity with vigilance. One night, after an especially chaotic dinner service, Boris collapsed onto a stool and announced, "This mon ami is not living. This is being pickled alive." He laughed, but it was a brittle, exhausted sound. I nodded, too tired to answer. The kitchen roared around us, indifferent to our despair. Yet something within me resisted complete surrender. Perhaps pride, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps simply the human need to believe in the possibility of change, however faint. The descent was real and steep, but some instinct insisted that it must lead somewhere, if not to improvement, then at least to understanding. For now, though, the descent continued. The Paris I once knew, of quiet cafes and leisurely mornings, had dissolved entirely. A new Paris, darker and more intimate, had taken its place. And in its shadowed corners, the next turn in the spiral waited quietly, preparing itself. There comes a point when poverty ceases to be a condition and becomes instead a landscape, one so vast and intricate that one cannot see beyond its borders. It was in this landscape, deep in the sweltering belly of the Paris kitchens, that the true breaking point arrived. Perhaps it had been building for weeks, announced by the mounting exhaustion, the increasingly frantic pace of work, or the slow erosion of dignity that accompanied every shouted insult. But when it came, it arrived with the suddenness of a snapped rope. The restaurant had received a reservation for a private banquet, 20 courses for a party of foreign dignitaries who demanded, above all else, perfection. Perfection, of course, was to be achieved by the brutal labor of those of us hidden below ground, our hands blistered and our shirts glued to our backs with sweat. By noon the kitchen resembled a battlefield. Pans were flung like projectiles. Saucepans boiled over, hissing like angry serpents. The chefs moved with the violent choreography of soldiers under fire. "Yo, faster!" roared Jules, the sous chef, as he thrust a stack of blackened pans toward me. His eyes gleamed with the righteous fury of a man who believed chaos could be conquered only through volume. I scrubbed feverishly, the greasy water splashing up my arms. My wrists trembled from fatigue, the muscles twitching like overworked wires. Boris worked beside me, limping more noticeably than usual. Sweat dripped from his nose onto the plates he stacked, but no one cared. Hygiene belonged to a different social class. "We shall die here, mon ami," he muttered between breaths, "and they will serve us as the 21st course." The joke, dark as it was, lifted our spirits for a fleeting moment. But the kitchen demanded its tribute. The pace intensified and the line between movement and panic blurred. My thoughts shrank to the rhythm of scrubbing. Scrape, rinse, stack, scrape, rinse, stack. The heat pressed into my skull like an iron band. Somewhere above us the banquet guests were likely discussing art, politics, or the weather in their polished accents. Down here our world contracted into sweat, grease, and orders bellowed in a frenzy. Poverty had stripped life of variety. Everything became a repetition of toil. Then came the moment of collapse. A mountain of pots, greasy, oversized, terrifying in their weight, toppled from a counter. I reached instinctively to steady them, misjudging both their center of gravity and my own dwindling strength. The largest pot struck my forearm with a sickening thud. Pain seared up to my shoulder, white and blinding. The world narrowed to a pinprick. For a moment I thought I might faint, but the thought of falling onto the filthy floor, onto the scattered bones and peelings, was repulsive enough to keep me conscious. I leaned against the sink, breathing in short, ragged gasps. Jules noticed only long enough to bark, "Get on with it. We're not running a hospital." The injustice of it hit with more force than the pot itself. Pain, humiliation, and exhaustion fused into a single hot surge. Beside me, Boris placed a hand on my back, the gesture clumsy but sincere. "Enough," he whispered. "You must stop. You will collapse." Perhaps I would have listened if the next order had not been shouted with such venom. "Move, you English fool," a chef snarled, shoving a stack of dishes toward me so hard they clattered like cymbals. Something in me finally broke. I slammed the dishes onto the counter with a violence that startled even myself. "Do it yourself," I said, not loudly but with a clarity that cut through the kitchen's roar. A sudden, dangerous silence fell. Faces turned. The cook stared as though witnessing a dog bite its master. Jules approached, his expression tight with disbelief. "What did you say?" "I'm finished," I replied, the words surprising me by their steadiness. "You can wash your own plates." Boris's eyes widened with terror and admiration. "Mon ami," he murmured, "this is suicide." Perhaps it was. But in that moment, I felt a sensation long absent, the faintest echo of self-respect. Poverty had choked it nearly to death, but it had survived somewhere beneath the grime. Jules gestured toward the exit. "Get out. And don't come back." The dismissal struck not as a punishment but as an unexpected release. I removed my apron, stiff with grease, and let it fall to the floor. When I stepped out into the cool night air, it was as though a weight had been lifted from my lungs. The sky above Paris, smudged with stars, felt impossibly vast. Boris joined me moments later. "I too am finished," he said simply. "They cannot make me stay without you." Besides, the chef tried to throw a ladle at me. It missed, but the intention was unforgivable. Despite everything, pain, hunger, uncertainty, we laughed. Not with the laughter of joy, but the laughter of men who had survived something intolerable and knew it. We walked through the lamplit streets with no destination. Paris appeared different now, almost sympathetic in its indifference. The river glimmered like a dark ribbon, and the whisper of the night breeze felt like a balm. Yet beneath this fragile calm lay a deeper fear. Without the kitchen, we had no income. Without income, there was only the precipice of homelessness. But the decision could not be undone. Pride, once awakened, demanded its due. Still, as we passed the shuttered cafes and silent market stalls, I felt something else stirring too, an awareness that the lowest point had been reached. And reaching the bottom, paradoxically, offered a kind of clarity. There was nowhere further to fall. Only forward somehow. Once the kitchen spit us out, bruised, exhausted, but strangely liberated, the precarious balance of survival in Paris lasted only a few days. My meager savings dwindled to nothing, and Boris, despite his bravado, soon found himself bedridden with an infection in his leg. The doctor demanded a fee we could not scrape together, and so, with regret pressing against my ribs, I made the decision to leave Paris altogether. London, the city of my birth, suddenly seemed less like a homecoming and more like a potential refuge, one where perhaps poverty would be less absolute. That illusion did not withstand even the first hour on English soil. The air in London possessed a different texture, thicker with smoke and dampness. The sky hung low, a great gray lid clamping down on the city. Streets swarmed with men who walked quickly, their collars up and eyes lowered, as though life demanded constant motion lest one be overtaken by misfortune. The smell of coal mingled with the scent of frying fish and the sourness of unwashed clothes. I arrived with nothing but a frayed suitcase and a letter of introduction so insignificant that I might as well have carried a blank sheet of paper. The first night I spent in a cheap lodging house in Southwark, a place so bleak it made my Paris hotel seem luxurious. The dormitory groaned beneath the weight of snoring bodies. Bedbugs patrolled the seams of the mattresses like tiny soldiers guarding their territory. The windows rattled as though eager to escape their frames. In the morning I set out to seek work. Day after day I trudged through the maze of streets, from the Strand to Whitechapel, from Kensington to the docks. I presented myself at hotels, restaurants, and labor exchanges. Some employers stared through me with polite indifference. Others dismissed me before I finished my request. More than one laughed outright when I mentioned my experience as a plongeur, as though dishwashing were an exotic Parisian hobby rather than a profession. By the end of the first week, my money was gone. And so I joined the ranks of the tramps, a population as invisible as shadows yet forced into perpetual motion by the law. One could not remain idle. Police patrolled to ensure the homeless did not settle in any one spot. Each night required walking great distances simply to avoid arrest. I wandered with groups of men who resembled ghosts in tattered clothes, their faces hollowed by hunger and cold. We moved from workhouse to shelter, from shelter to casual ward, always seeking a bed and a bowl of something allegedly edible. In these wards, suffering attained a level of organization that was almost admirable. The poor were managed like troublesome livestock, registered, counted, fed the minimum required to remain alive. The nights were the worst. The cold crept through one's clothes until it felt like an invasive species, colonizing every limb. Sleep arrived in snatches, stolen between gusts of wind or the footsteps of constables. Hunger gnawed with a steady persistence, a quiet torture rather than the sharp pangs I had known in Paris. My mind began to assume a strange clarity, life reduced to the elemental concerns of warmth, shelter, and food. During this time, I met Paddy, an Irish tramp with a broken laugh and an encyclopedic knowledge of every place in London where one could rest without being immediately thrown out. He took me under his wing with a generosity rare among those who own so little. "You're a decent sort," he told me one evening as we trudged along the embankment, "but ye think too much. Thinking's a luxury out here." He was right. Poverty stripped away contemplation. It forced the mind to narrow until only the next hour mattered. Paddy introduced me to Bozo, a pavement artist whose optimism rivaled even Boris's. Despite having lost a leg in an accident, Bozo refused to succumb to the bitterness that afflicted most tramps. He spoke of colors, of art, of the dignity of honest effort, even when his day's earnings amounted to only a few coppers. "Beauty still exists," he once said, gesturing at the River Thames, which was then little more than a strip of dark, oily water. "You just need the right eyes to see it." His resilience startled me. It reminded me of what Boris had been in Paris, another man clinging to a fragment of hope in the midst of decay. Yet despite the unlikely camaraderie, the truth remained. Life on the streets of London was a slow undoing. The endless walking wore through my boots until the soles gaped like open mouths. My trousers grew stiff with dirt. My beard thickened. There were moments when I no longer recognized myself in the darkened reflections of shop windows. I was becoming part of the gray mass, one more unwanted figure drifting through the city's underbelly. And still, through the exhaustion and humiliation, I sensed something shifting inside me. The hardship had gone past mere suffering and entered the realm of revelation. I saw now, with stark clarity, the machinery of poverty, how society tolerated the poor so long as they remained invisible, silent, and in motion, how dignity was not considered an inherent human right but a luxury purchased with money. In the tramps' wards, I met men who had once been clerks, teachers, soldiers, men undone not by laziness but by misfortune so banal in its cruelty that it seemed designed by a bureaucrat. Their stories shared one refrain: poverty is not an individual failure but a collective decision. A society chooses how many people must freeze, starve, and wander without rest. As autumn approached, the nights grew sharper. Fog blanketed the city, muffling its sounds and making even familiar streets feel alien. One evening, as I lay on a hard wooden bench outside a closed church, I realized that the spiral that had begun in Paris had now reached its longest shadow in London. I was surviving, yes, but only just. And something within me knew that this condition could not continue indefinitely. I needed work. I needed purpose. I needed to stand up again. And somewhere, faint as a distant lamp in the fog, the first hint of an upward turn flickered. The fog that clung to London in those weeks seemed not merely a weather condition but a physical expression of uncertainty, of life suspended between misery and possibility. Each evening, trudging through streets that blurred into the same endless gray, I wondered whether I would ever climb out of the pit I had stumbled into. Yet it is often at the moment when despair becomes routine, no longer a shock but a dull rhythm, that change, improbable and indifferent, finally arrives. It began with a letter. Or rather, with an envelope that bore my name in hesitant handwriting. I found it at the lodging house where I sometimes received mail, usually months late. The letter came from an acquaintance in Paris, a schoolmaster I had met long before my fall into destitution. He wrote simply that a friend of his in London, engaged in charitable work, might be able to recommend me for a position as a tutor or assistant. Nothing was promised, but the possibility alone felt like an intrusion of sunlight into the long shadow of poverty. I went at once to the address he provided, a modest brick building in Bloomsbury, its windows stacked with books and its doorway decorated with nothing more ostentatious than a brass knocker. Inside, I met a man named Mr. Simmons, a wiry fellow with spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. His voice was gentle, though tinged with the caution of someone too accustomed to disappointment. "You are seeking work?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Any honest work at all." He studied me for a moment, perhaps taking in the worn clothes, the frayed collar, the thinness that hardship had etched into my cheeks. But instead of judgment, his gaze held something like understanding. "It so happens," he said slowly, "that a small preparatory school outside London requires temporary assistance. Poor pay, I'm afraid, and a great deal of tedious work. But it is work." The word itself felt like a rope lowered into a well. He wrote a brief note of introduction and sent me on my way. 2 days later I stood before the school, a squat, drafty building attended by boys whose manners had been shaped less by education than by the careless privileges of their parents. The headmaster, a man of severe aspect, eyed me as though suspecting I might collapse from hunger before the first lesson. Nonetheless, he hired me. The transition from tramp to schoolteacher was comically abrupt. One day I was sleeping under bridges. The next I was drilling boys in Latin declensions and attempting to maintain order in classrooms where chaos was the norm. The work was exhausting in a different way from the kitchens of Paris. Less physical, more psychological. But it offered something I had not possessed in months: stability. My meals were regular, if uninspired. My bed was narrow and lumpy, but warm. The boys mocked my accent, my clothes, my awkward insistence on proper grammar. Yet even their mischief carried a strange comfort, a reminder that I had rejoined, however tenuously, the realm of the living. In the evenings, when the boys finally retired to their dormitories, I walked alone through the small village surrounding the school. The lanes were muddy, the cottages plain, but after the restlessness of London's nights, the silence felt almost luxurious. I began to recover, not simply in body but in the parts of the mind that poverty had starved. Thought returned. Reflection returned. I found myself contemplating the months behind me, the long chain of degradations and revelations, and realizing that poverty had taught me more about the structure of society than any book or lecture ever could. One afternoon, while supervising a group of boys attempting to construct a model bridge out of matchsticks, I overheard a conversation between two visiting parents. They spoke of the unemployed with the casual cruelty of those who have never been hungry, speculating about moral weakness and indolence as though these were scientific facts. Their words tightened something inside me, a knot of anger I had not felt since Paris. It struck me then with renewed clarity. The world was designed not to see the poor, and when it did see them, it preferred to view them as failures rather than victims of circumstance. To survive poverty was not merely a physical struggle but an intellectual awakening, an illumination of society's hidden scaffolding. By the time my temporary position neared its end, I had regained enough strength, both practical and spiritual, to imagine a future again. My clothes, though still shabby, no longer hung from me like rags. My hands, once cracked from endless scrubbing, had begun to heal. My pride, which had been battered nearly to dust, felt tentatively intact. The headmaster summoned me on my final day. "We cannot keep you on," he said briskly, "but you have performed your duties adequately. That is more than can be said for some." It was hardly praise, but it was enough. I returned to London, not as a tramp, but as a man searching for opportunities with renewed purpose. And though I did not yet know what form my life would take, I felt something I had not felt since before the Rue du Coq d'Or, the faint but undeniable assurance that I was no longer sliding downward. Poverty had not released me entirely, but it had loosened its grip. I had walked through its chambers, its filth, its humiliation, its strange and terrible camaraderie, and emerged with the understanding that hardship, while destructive, can also reveal truths obscured by comfort. What remained in the end was not despair but perspective, a recognition that society is a fragile construct, maintained by illusions of superiority and stability, and that beneath those illusions lies a vast hidden world, inhabited by countless lives as real and complex as those above them. As I stood on Blackfriars Bridge watching the Thames churn beneath the gathering dusk, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness, only a sober clarity. I had been down and out. I was neither ashamed nor proud of it. It was a fact, like hunger, like cold, like survival. And from that fact I would go forward.